Hello everyone, this is Kat and welcome back to My Hero Academia Podfics. This will be the continuation of Deku and Death. This will be Part 40, Chapter 40, entitled Fragile Like Glass. Contrary to the blissful sleep hours longer than Midori was used to, the shrill alarm of his phone was not as pleasant. It startled him out of paradise, leaving him mumbling curses under his breath as the last wisp of it had left his mind. Regardless, he was quick to turn it off for not only his own mental fortitude, but to spare himself the headache that would inevitably be waking up Gran Torino. After yesterday's fiasco, he wasn't sure there was much he could do to restrain Gami from the most threatening thing that he could possibly do as a ghost, with temperamental solidity. Still, he refused to deal with that. He was putting his foot down. Speaking of his mentor, Gami floated patiently in the corner of the small and frankly unstable room. He hadn't said a word upon his waking, but this silence was completely opposite from that of yesterday's. Midori could feel it in the air, just the subtle reassurance that he'd woken up to a completely new day. He knew he should have pressed the issue. All he had were fragments of assumptions, and among his greatest fears was the unknown. He was so scared of being clueless and helpless and out of control that should have been enough to make him press for more, but a steady underlying fear of his was still confrontation, and as safe as being in the company of his mentor made him feel, he hesitated nonetheless. Gami would tell him when he was ready, whatever it was. He trusted him. He respected his privacy. This was not an excuse. Fully adorned in his hero costume, Midori decided after this morning it needed to be washed. How he should wash something of this caliber, he had no idea, but surely it couldn't be that hard. He hesitated with the hat, but ended up putting it on anyway, pressing it firmly into his bed hair. "I am surprised I managed to stay on in the spa yesterday," Gami remarked, and honestly he'd been wondering the same thing. "Probably some kind of crazy support gimmick." Midori shrugged, twisted open his room door. "Honestly, I don't think I want to know." The sentiment was obvious. Not a fan of the hat? The teen trotted down the stairs with a slow and gentle step, but he still managed to shoot Gami a sarcastic look from over his shoulder. "I mean, the cover's great. I appreciate Nezu making it easier to talk to you, but why not a hood or anything else more practical?" "You know, if it isn't getting under your skin so much, then it was likely because Nezu wanted it to bother you. It is probably his way of messing with your head." Midori didn't respond, but Gami caught a mutter of something about wishy-washy rodents, and honestly, who was he to disagree? "I am sure once we get back you can ask for a modification." Midori grumbled, but he stopped complaining, so Gami took it as a success. The two had passed by what they had assumed was Gran Torino's room, and for a moment Midori paused in front of the door. He had no idea what feeling the air was supposed to entail, and based on yesterday's pitiful performance, there wasn't much that he could do other than constantly fail and hope to magically figure it out. He wanted to learn. He wanted to be taught. He had come here so that Gran Torino could help him, and while yesterday the hero wasn't all that accommodating, Midori held on to the silent hope that today might be the start of what he was looking for. Instead, he heard a soft snore echo from behind the closed door. Guess he was on his own again. The front door made an obnoxious squeak as he had pushed it open, but after a moment went by and no sound of rousing could be heard, Midori had slipped out quiet as a mouse. The sun had barely begun peeking from the horizon, and even though this area was akin to a wasteland, he still found himself scurrying to the alleyway next to Gran Torino's building to get out of sight. Once he was in the safety of the darkness of the alley, he allowed himself to relax, leaning against one of the walls as he had looked down at his hands. "So, mutual agreement to not force out any blasts?" "I don't know how that's mutual when I'm the only one who can, but sure." Midori pulled off his gloves carefully, stuffing them into one of the pockets on his belt. "I don't want to hurt myself anyway. I thought we established that." "With your recklessness, how can anyone be sure?" The line was cold, but Gami's flair had made it obvious that he was only teasing. The teen bit back a snarky remark, catching his breath. He was out here for serious business, not to screw around, so he left Gami reeling at his own wittiness, retreating back into his thoughts. Feeling the air. He guessed it made sense on paper. His decay worked on physical contact, however slight it was. When he had touched the earth, only a piece of metal from Dagobah or a pound of mutant flesh from the USJ, his DT flowed right into it. He supposed he never really thought about it as a feeling. It had always been instinctual since Gami had first taught him the basics of control, but maybe that was where he was going wrong. Maybe he was becoming too instinctual. He didn't think about his decay. He just allowed it free passage. He controlled the floodgates, not the flow. But how was he even supposed to begin feeling the air? Technically, he was always touching it. Right now, as he flexed his bare fingers, he was technically touching the air, but it didn't feel like anything. Not in the way solid earth or metal or flesh did. He almost had those textures ingrained into his memory at this point, some more permanently than others. How was air supposed to feel? Because it wasn't like the slick chill of metal, or grainy richness of earth, or even the smooth flow of water. It was just there. So he tried to start like he did at Dagoba a few days ago, calling forth his DT through his veins and to his fingertips. He could feel it pulling there, screaming at him to be released. Midori had to actively hold it back, his nerves buzzing uncomfortably from the backlash. It took most of his concentration to just keep himself from being overwhelmed by his own power. He couldn't possibly think about what the air felt like while doing this. He slumped further against the wall, just trying to keep his hands steady and himself upright, but everything was just quickly becoming too much. His mind was overwhelmed. Too much of his focus was dedicated toward the fragile ebb and flow that was being piped full of decay and not being able to use it. His balance gave out on him, and one of his charged hands went straight for the wall behind him to hold himself up, failing to remember that the wall was actually a building and that one simple touch right now could send it crumbling. Thankfully, Gami was more than prepared to catch him and redirect him toward the nearest pile of expendable debris. Unfortunately, that was a pile of garbage bags, but he decayed the one that he touched so fast he didn't even have time to feel grossed out. All right, no more of that. Gami's tone held no room for argument. This is exactly what you were trying before, and it is clearly not working. Midori was much too woozy to even bother combating him, just trying to make sure he wasn't going to split the concrete underneath him as he had pressed his hands down for support. We need a different strategy. Perhaps trying to feel the air right off the bat is too ambitious. The teen nodded absent-mindedly, breathing very slowly as to quell the rockiness in his stomach. Trying to mold the flow of decay was so unnaturally difficult, like it was actively fighting against him. It was all so frustrating. If he had the energy, he'd be complaining right now, but he was too drained to even talk. Gami left his successor to handle himself, looking around the alleyway for ideas. He wasn't all too good at this stuff. His creativity must have died with him. He was very used to following Midori's lead, used to being his support, but he refused to just float here and watch the boy try and fail aimlessly. How about this? The ghost had turned back, hovering over the discarded pile of trash bags that had clearly been collecting in the alleyway. You can decay these like normal, but maybe move your hand off while you do. Maybe it'll transfer to the air as you do. Midori shrugged, picking his mess of a form back up. The logic was shaky, but it wasn't like he had any better ideas. He moved over to the trash bag, squatting by the base of the pile. It was a little gross, but he shook the thoughts off, placing a hand faintly on the skin of the bag. DT came forth ever so naturally, but he slowed the rush to a crawl, trying to give himself more time. The bag slowly began flaking away to dust, and Midori tried to ignore the shiver that trailed up his spine as trash started spilling out. He let the decay continue for a bit longer, just to really think about how it felt, before gently taking his hand off of the bag and suspending it mid-air. And nothing. The disintegration just stopped, completely cut off from its exit. He could feel the buzz almost yell at him for denying it release, but it made absolutely no effort to continue while in the air. It was just like how he used to stop himself from disintegrating things before he got his gloves. What was he expecting? Gami looked a little lost on what to do now, and honestly Midori was more than hopeless at this point. But he wasn't going to give in so early. It had barely been an hour since they'd gotten out here. Maybe decay a couple of bags before trying again. There's a lot of junk here, no worries about running out of material. With a heavy sigh, Midori moved back to the trash pile. It felt a lot like Dagoba. If you tried not to think about it, it was all just a lot of garbage. There was no reason why this was any grosser than the scraps that had piled up on that beach. It was just some weird placebo thing going on in his brain. It wasn't like the stuff at Dagoba was washed by the seawater or anything. He managed to get through a couple of bags before the thought broke his concentration, instinctually, making him move his hand away from the trash, but still nothing. But Gami was right. There was plenty of stuff to work with here, so he just went right back to it. Every few objects, or every time that he felt like he had a good handle on his DT, he tried to move from them to the emptiness of the air, and every single time he went right back to more stuff. He didn't know when he'd become a human waste disposer, but it had happened at some point, because eventually he'd run out of trash bags from the seemingly enormous pile that he'd started with, and like a human waste disposer, he and Gami went in search of more. Midori didn't know how many trash bags he'd disintegrated at this point, but he did know that he'd turned 13 cardboard boxes, 9 broken wooden shipping pallets, and a bicycle tarnished beyond repair to dust without success, and it was starting to get to him. Come on! And after a couple fruitless hours and way too much dust, he finally broke. Are you serious? How am I supposed to make any kind of progress if I don't know what I'm doing? It was times like these that Gami had wished that he had more of his memories that weren't seemingly disjointed and unhelpful pieces of his life. Knowing that even in life he was loved by someone was great, but he really wished that he could remember the ins and outs of his abilities. He was around for 500 years, for goodness sake. He probably knew everything about how these finicky powers had worked, and the thought that he didn't have access to any of that was beyond depressing. The ghost had been so stuck in his own wallowing, he didn't realize how upset his successor was growing, not until he could practically see the smoke billowing him in his ears. And there are no heroes with quirks like mine because this whole system is rigged. Why do I have to be the first one to figure all this out? Why couldn't there have been someone else before me? This world doesn't want to see me as a hero. It never did. Midoriya's hands were shaking, and Gami couldn't tell if it was from anger or the sheer amount of DT corralled in his veins, or even some combination of the two. Regardless, as unprepared as he was, the ghost had moved to step in, beyond worried that Midoriya was going to blow a fuse. "Maybe we should take a break for today," he suggested, nervously glancing around for something, anything, he could use in case Midoriya's DT started to get out of hand, literally. "Get some lunch, come up with a new plan, you know?" But the teen was not calmed. "No, I don't want to quit. I refuse to quit until I get somewhere, or else I'm just going to be quitting for the whole week." The spitefulness pleased something deep and alien in the ghost's soul, something he decided then and there that he did not like. But he brushed his worries aside, floating closer to the boy, outstretching his hands as a sign of peace and comfort. "We are not quitting. We will come back. But I just think that it would be best to—" "No!" Midoriya angrily swung his hands down from his sides in a frustrated fit. "I said—" A loud boom had rocked them both, blowing stray dust and Midoriya off his feet. Gami shielded himself instinctually as a burst of air had rushed through him, dragging a cloud of dirt and ash down the alley. Once the air had cleared, he could clearly see his successor knocked onto his back and staring up at him in shock. It took a moment for the pieces to click for them both, truly grasping the situation. "Did you just—" Gami trailed off, his words dying, but the thought resounding like a pierce to the heart. Midoriya looked down, raising his hands closer to his face. He stared deeply into his palms, up to his fingers, then down to his arms again. But no matter how he looked, they were still, completely and utterly still. His hands weren't shaking. More importantly, as the seconds had ticked by and the adrenaline from his anger officially died off, they didn't hurt. The words got caught in his throat. "My hands." He looked up at Gami with a pale expression, one full of all sides of disbelief. "My hands don't hurt." He said it like it was the calmest thing in the world, but once the admission had left his lips, reality smacked him right in the face. "I did it?" Midoriya shot back down to his hands. "I did it! How did I do it?" Gami watched the teen spiral back down to the same well of intensity, but he made no move to help him. Much too flabbergasted himself. How had he done it? What made this different from what they were trying earlier, and more importantly, what made this different from the blast Midoriya had done during the sports festival? Was it the emotion? The anger? That's what they had speculated at Dagoba, but that couldn't be it. Midoriya had been feeling just that intensity of emotions during the festival, especially during his fight with Todoroki. If anything, the emotions were the trigger to forcing the blasts out, not what just happened. Was it instinct, the absence of an active thought? That couldn't be it either, or else all their experimentation would have prompted something, not the complete lack of results as they'd seen. But then what was different? There wasn't much else that had happened. It was all just basic movement that really left nothing. "The movement," Gami suddenly spoke, startling Midoriya out of what was almost another angry spiral. Of course, it was the swing. What? That was all his mushy brain could get out at the moment. It was so obvious. How did we not realize it before? The ghost was too busy kicking himself before realizing that he had to fill Midoriya in. "Your scythe." But he was still more than lost. "What about it?" Gami stopped to calm himself, his excitement blurring his thoughts and his movements. "You can use your scythe to make explosions. How?" "By—" It clicked. "Swinging it." "You have to swing your scythe to kickstart the decay. The swing, the breeze, your scythe is feeling the air." "It's the same DT, the same concept. That's what we established before." Their thoughts were one and the same, flowing through both of their heads. "I was trying to make blasts while my hands were still. That's why I couldn't do it. That's why I had to force them out." Even during the movement that was evading Todoroki's ice during their fight, all the times he'd made explosions were with still hands. Never had he once thought to give himself the same leeway that he'd gave his scythe. With a giddy little grin on his face, Midori took in a breath and held out one of his hands. He welled up DT from his blood, pulling it like usual in his hands, really getting that buzz riled up, and tentatively he swung the hand hard and fast in front of him, the very same way he would his scythe, feeling the breeze at his fingertips for just a moment. Another loud explosion reverberated between the alley walls, kicking up dust and dirt again. Midori lost his balance from the recoil, but managed to keep himself upright this time, shakily replacing his footing. It was a pretty sizable blast, nothing like the explosions that had kept him alive in his fight against Todoroki, but it still packed a punch, enough that he had to figure out how to counterbalance the recoil. The air cleared, and he looked up to see Gami's reaction. Though he couldn't see the ghost's expression, he could feel the excitement rolling off his wisps. He looked back down at his hand. It wasn't shaking. It didn't hurt. The smile on his face had exploded. Gami tackled him, wrapped him into an ecstatic hug. He was laughing, and then they both started laughing and smiling and jumping for joy in the most wholesome mosh pit there ever was in an abandoned alley. "There's so much I can do now," Midori cheered, separating himself from his mentor's grasp, so he could speak clearly. "The mobility, the offensive potential. My notebook has some stuff on Bakugo and Ito's movements. I can do that now." "Slow down there," Gami chuckled, placing his hands firmly on the teen's shoulders. "You need to get this down consistently before you go trying any of that. No recovery girl out here, remember?" That was a fair point. Midori presumed there just wasn't a universe where Gami was wrong. But that was besides the fact. This was progress. He could spend a couple of more hours out here, really get the feel for what he was doing. Enough experimentation with the recoil effects would help him to stay balanced with every blast. He could even use the recoil to his own advantage, propelling himself into the air, changing his direction in a split second. Would Bakugo like it? No, but who cared? This was his success, his improvement. This was the step forward that he was looking for. No one could take that from him. His stomach rumbled obnoxiously, running on nothing but tea and taiyaki from the night before. Lunchtime. No arguments. Midori's shoulders dropped, but he couldn't argue even if he wanted to, a sudden, crippling cramp in his side taking the air from his lungs. Yeah, lunchtime. It was only when they got back did they realize that there was still no food in the fridge, which certainly wasn't any sort of motivator to return. Midori didn't acknowledge Gran Torino's newfound presence on the couch as he had walked inside, and thankfully neither did the hero. The teen was not in any sort of mood to conversate. He could barely hide his annoyance with the elder hero to begin with. He took a deep breath as he walked up the stairs, depositing his hero costume in his room before stepping into the bathroom for a quick shower. Gran Torino was a fantastic hero. He'd proven that when he got his ass beat by the man yesterday. He wanted to work with him. He wanted to be taught. He just hoped that the rest of the week wouldn't be like this. Gami was nice enough to have a set of clothes waiting for him on the sink countertop when he had stepped out of the shower. How the ghost had managed to pick up the clothes and open the door with them in hand, Midori didn't know. But Gami's solidity did seem to be getting better, all of a sudden. It was still temperamental as always, but at least it was becoming a bit more consistent nowadays. He couldn't really ask for much more from his mentor. He was just thankful for what he could give. He'd almost surprised himself when he looked into the mirror to see the reflection of his skin. He was wearing short sleeves, but he almost forgot why he used to be so adverse to wearing them. His bare hand had trailed down the burn scar that peeked out from his collar. That was really the only one that was visible. The others on his biceps were either covered easily by his sleeves or too faint to see unless he had looked for them. Of course, there was still that ugly mark on his wrist, the grip that it came from, being seared permanently into him. He hated it so much. He hated that he would never be rid of it. But his glove covered most of it, so at least he didn't have to see it more than he needed to. His fingers rubbed at his neck again. It really didn't feel any different than the rest of his skin, but even the mere sight of it was blinding to his eyes. "All good in there," Gami called from beyond the door hesitantly. Midori shook his head, shook himself out of his own thoughts. He quickly slipped on his gloves, covering the other scar that could possibly be noticed in short sleeves. "Yeah, sorry for the wait," he muttered under his breath as he opened up the door. They made their way back to the room that Midori had claimed. "You do not have to wear that if you don't want to. I just figured I would bring that to you since you'd brought more of those than your typical wear." No, it's fine." Midori waved him off, slipping his phone into his pocket of his shorts and grabbing the bundle of his hero costume. "I kind of miss it, you know?" The ghost breathed out a sigh of relief. "Oh, good. I was a little worried it would change your demeanor." "I don't want it to make me feel bad anymore," he admitted, gesturing to himself up and down, to his short-sleeved shirt, to his discolored pigmentation, to the lightness in his heart. "I'm okay with it. Who cares what other people think?" There was still some remnants of hesitation in his voice, but if Gami heard it, he didn't acknowledge it, instead ruffling his damp hair. "Screw everyone else." He hadn't meant to say it so harshly, but his successor only seemed to sputter for a moment before releasing a fit of giggles. The words just came out so naturally, almost as a subconscious response to Midoriya's self-prioritizing statement before. It was odd enough to linger in his mind for longer than a few moments, but he didn't think too much more into it. He refused to. He was Gami. Maybe not before, but that's who he was now. The duo descended to the first floor, and it took a couple of doors before Midoriya had found the laundry room. He still wasn't sure how to properly wash his costume, but he wasn't about to wear it dirty the entire week, so he tossed it into the machine, set it onto the most delicate setting that he could, and hoped for the best. "So, what are you doing for lunch?" The million-dollar question. Just thinking about food made his stomach churn in anticipation. "Well, it's not like there's anything here." He'd offered to cook yesterday, though that was before he was made aware of the abysmal state of the kitchen. Still, he wasn't about to eat taiyaki for the rest of the week. He had personal standards, both as a hero student and to his stomach. He supposed Yamada's cooking had spoiled him just a bit as well, but he would never admit that. They walked together into the main space, not expecting Gran Torino to be off the couch and preparing himself some tea. "Morning." His voice was back to the chipper tone it was like yesterday, before he revealed his true nature. "What were you doing up so early? You looked wrecked." Midori looked over himself sporadically. He looked like he'd just gotten out of the shower, but he certainly didn't look wasted. "I was trying to feel the air, like you said. I'm not sure I have it down 100%, but I'm making progress." It was an invitation into his training, an invitation for assistance. He didn't really know what he was doing, just figuring things out along the way, and some help, any help, would be really appreciated. "Good to hear. Where are you off to now?" Midoriya's hope deflated. "I'm just going to get some lunch." He was going to get some groceries while he was out, too. He didn't have too much money to spare, but it was that or taiyaki, and honestly, he'd made up his mind with that a long time ago. Gran Torino perked up at that. "If that's the case, there's a list on the fridge of stuff I'm running low on." The elder said nothing more. Sitting himself down at the small table to sip his drink, Midoriya turned away, grumbling under his breath as he walked to the fridge to see a list that definitely wasn't there yesterday. He snatched it off, not even bothering to read it before stuffing it away. "There's money in the drawer," Gran Torino pointed offhandedly, taking another sip. "You said yesterday that you cooked. Just don't go breaking my bank, all right?" Confused, Midoriya carefully opened the drawer that he was directed to. Gami curiously peeked over his shoulder. He easily found what the hero was referring to, a small envelope filled with loose bills. He nervously looked back at the hero, extremely unsure if he should really be taking this, but if Gran Torino noticed he was staring, he made no comment. So he only took a few bills as a precaution. If he needed more, he'd use his own cash. "The store's a walk away, 7 or 8 blocks. You can't miss it, trust me. Not much else around here anyways." That was helpful. He'd probably just look up the nearest grocery store on his phone and hope that that was the right one. Still, he gave him thanks and left out through the front door for the second time today. They were walking for some time before Gami had spoken up, breaking the silence. "I still do not know how I feel about him." "Tell me about it," Midori shrugged, pulling out the list from his pocket. "He kind of reminds me of you in a way." Gami gasped, a flabbergasted look overtaking him. "I beg your pardon." The teen didn't make an effort to look back at him. "You both are sassy little shits. You're just more lovable." "Well, The ghost was caught between feeling heart-warmed or offended. "Whatever." Midori laughed. "I guess you're a little more different than that. I mean, who needs this much taiyaki?" Gami awkwardly joined in on the chuckle as they continued down the street, reading the list from over his shoulder. In his other hand, Midori held out his phone, making sure that he was heading the right way. It was just for his own comfort at this point. Gran Torino hadn't been lying when he said to just hold right. He absent-mindedly exited the app, about to open back up the Hosu article he was reading a few days before, but he caught himself. He hoped Ida was doing all right. He hadn't heard from her at all. To be fair, it was only early afternoon on the second day, but he was just a naturally worrisome person, and right now Ida was worrying him. He debated sending his friend a quick text, but the hateful stare that Ida had given him on the train had flashed through his head. "What does it matter to you? Stop sticking your nose where it doesn't belong." Maybe it was best not to push him on this any further. What about Todoroki? How was he doing? He was interning with Endeavor, so Midori figured he probably wouldn't have a lot of free time to talk, but a quick message wouldn't hurt, could it? He opened up his messages. "Hey, how's your internship going?" He left it at that, slipping his phone back into his pocket. If he needed the GPS, he'd pull it back out again, but he figured that he'd be fine without one, as the few lively buildings he'd seen around the neighborhood had entered his vision. "That has to be it, right?" Gami flew a bit further ahead, trying to get a closer look. "Pretty sure. I haven't been counting the blocks, but we've been walking for a bit." And sure enough it was. A quaint little grocery store stood out from the rest of the decrepit buildings, almost calling him inside. It probably was, with the way that the sweet aroma of food had wafted from the inside. He was suddenly reminded of how hungry he was, and opted to make this trip as quick as possible. Midori walked inside. It was practically empty, save for the cashier who had sported him a wave upon looking up from their phone. He gave a shy little wave back, just out of formality, before grabbing a basket by the entrance and slinking into the emptiness of the back. "What is on this list?" Gami read from above him. "Milk, eggs, taiyaki, of course, and tea." Gami stopped talking. "Hey, what's wrong?" Midori whispered, eyeing around for cameras. "Gami?" "I apologize. I was lost in thought." The boy raised an eyebrow. "You're fine. Did you remember something?" he asked, recalling few but notable instances where a simple word had triggered a blast from the past. Gami paused for just a moment, not hesitantly long, not eagerly short, but some middle ground of a moment that gave off the illusion of a typical conversation. "No, I will go get what is on the list. You should get food that can actually be used to cook." Midori didn't even have a chance to voice how bad of an idea that was before the ghost just flew off, leaving him staying alone in the back of the aisle. He worried, but he trusted Gami. He trusted Gami if he said that nothing was wrong. He trusted Gami to come to him when he was ready, if he was. He trusted him with the immortal life, with a heart and soul that could never be broken and yet still very much was. It was only natural for him to worry about someone he trusted so much. His stomach rumbled, reminding him of his purpose here. Food. He really should have caught up to his mentor before he got himself into a stupid situation with his tangibility, but he supposed there was only so much one measly ghost could do, and if anything, he could always lie about his quirk or feign ignorance to get out of it. It wasn't like he was ever going to be here again. So he moved down the aisle, running on a mental list of basic necessities: rice, miso, any noodles he could find. Eggs were already on the list, so fried rice was definitely an option if he found some good veggies. He wouldn't mind finding some protein. Chicken or fish sounded lovely right about now. Even some curry packets were on the table, and they were quick and easy to make, and he knew which brands he could actually stomach. Midori went around, making a mental note of the lack of cameras in the store. It was a rough part of the city for sure, but it didn't seem dangerous, just empty. Regardless, it was one less thing to worry about when he had a troublesome ghost with him. "I have the taiyaki." "Shit!" Midori caught himself and his volume. "Don't scare me like that. Did the cashier see you?" Gami almost looked offended as he dropped the box into the basket. "Of course not. This is Mia we are discussing. I practically taught you how to be stealthy." Midori knew that was not the case, but he didn't acknowledge it. "Just don't do anything stupid." Again, Gami flared dramatically. "As if." Then he was off again. Passing through the aisles themselves, the teen scoffed under his breath, moving toward the produce. He'd pick out some vegetables like he wanted, something to counterbalance the taiyaki sitting in the basket. He really, really hoped that Gran Torino was not existing off of takeout and taiyaki alone. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Midori sat down the thin plastic bag that he was using to collect the produce so he could have a hand free. "Good afternoon, Izuku. My internship is going well, as imagined, but I do believe that I made the right choice. Learning about my fire. I just wish the old bastard would shut up about it every once in a while. What about you?" He snorted slightly at Todoroki's choice of words, using his thumb to hastily chop out a response. "That's good to hear. Gran Torino is certainly eccentric, but I made my choice knowing that. I made some progress with my quirk this morning. You won't even recognize me once I get back." He figured he'd wait on a response before dumping more on his friend, slipping the phone away and returning to the produce stand. He had a pepper in hand when a soft drop could be heard from a few aisles down. He and the cashier looked up briefly, but the cashier must have assumed that he was the source, because not a moment after they had moved their focus onto something else. Midori wasted no time rushing toward the direction of the sound, tying up the bag of vegetables along the way. He stopped in front of a nervous-looking Gami with a box of tea at his feet. "Sorry, I was trying to pick it up." The teen shook his head. "It's fine. It was pretty impressive that you managed to interact as much as you already have today. I'll be getting the milk and eggs, though." He picked up the fallen box, surprised to see it was Shinsha. He wasn't expecting to find the small grocery store carrying it. It was probably old, then. Even overstock would be hard to find. He put it in the basket anyway, thinking it as petty revenge against Gran Torino's attitude so far. They walked together to the dairy section. Gami was kind and solid enough to hold the door open, as he had reached for a carton of milk and subsequently the eggs. He was just putting them in the basket as his phone had buzzed again. "I can't wait to see your improvements, but I'll likely be the most changed out of everyone." There was a pause. "I have some free time. Do you want to call?" Midori set the basket on the ground for a second so he could use both of his hands. Sure. Oh, so my company is not good enough anymore. Please, he scoffed teasingly. I'm stuck with you all the time. Gami turned away, crossing his arms in a pout. Midori gave him a playful shoulder nudge as he had accepted a call from his phone and brought it up to his ear. Hey, Shoto. The smile was audible. What you said before. Is that a challenge? The rest of the day went off without a hitch. Midori and Gami had returned with their grocery haul, the cashier none the wiser. Gran Torino had ordered a new microwave, and Midori had to both drag it inside and unpackage it by himself. He had come back for a second trip for the groceries as well. It was just too risky to have Gami actively interact with anything while Gran Torino had sat to watch. It was a bit of a shame. Midori missed the consistent extra help. He missed being able to talk with his mentor without a second thought. Living with Aizawa and Yamada really spoiled him even beyond what he first thought. But for what it was, the second day ended well. Midori cooked a pot of fried rice so delicious he wasn't sure that leftovers in the fridge would last until tomorrow. Though, the way that Gran Torino lived off of microwave food alone, he should have expected that. If there was anything his broken self-esteem could vouch for, it was that his cooking was fucking amazing. And seeing that reflected in the euphoria in Gran Torino's eyes had his heart swelling with pride, however temporary it was. He went to sleep easier that night and had no bad dreams to interrupt him. That was certainly nice. Waking up to his phone alarm, however, never was. Midori had guessed Gran Torino wasn't an early riser, or at least not as early as he was. He couldn't help the disappointment that welled up in his heart, but he could at least understand, more so than yesterday. It helped that he at least had more positive things to latch on to. Because here he was, shielded from the sun's sleepy rays by the side of Gran Torino's building, hours of sweat drenched his newly washed costume. Gami had barely managed to jot things down in his newest notebook, explosions ringing out every other second, smiling like joy had no end. "Run it again," Gami called out, waving his pen in a circle. It was a miracle that he could hold up both the pen and the notebook in the first place, much less write in it, but neither of them had commented on it beyond the initial shock. Midori needed help taking notes, and without Gran Torino, this was the best that he could do. He wasn't about to jinx things now. Midori grunted in response, hastily wiping the sweat from his brow. He held out his hands in front of him again, bending his knees slightly for more balance, leaning forward to control his center of gravity, and with a sharp swing, he had pulled his arms behind him in an aggressive breaststroke, lighting up the whole way with DT. Another explosion rang out, launching Midori forward with a cloud of dust in its wake. It was an impressive standing long jump, probably just over 8 feet, and he actually managed to land it this time without falling over. "You are improving quite rapidly. Your average launch distance keeps rising," the ghost commented, jotting that tidbit down. "You have really managed to get those blasts down consistently. I truly am impressed." The teen stood up straight, catching his breath. "Yeah, but I lose a lot of momentum every time I swing. It's not optimal. Did you get that down?" "Doing that now." Gami scribbled away, his hold on the writing supplies flickering every now and then, but otherwise solid. "I've definitely got better mobility, but it's not what I was really hoping for. With my blasts as they are, I've got farther jumps while standing still. I'd presume that would also make running jumps better if we decide to test that." Midori rambled, assuming that Gami was trailing his every word into his notebook. "But having to swing every time kills momentum. If I was able to fire blasts without hand movement like Bakugo can, I'd be able to do so much more. Ricochet off of walls, change direction midair, even launch myself so high I could scale the zero-pointer like he did during the obstacle course." Gami stopped writing to shake his head. "The blasts work like your scythe, remember? You need the swing in order to spark them." I know, but there has to be something I'm missing." He had to swing in order to spark the transfer of DT to the air. That was established. Otherwise, still air alone wasn't distinguishable enough for him to be able to decay. Still air didn't feel like anything, but swinging his hand left him grasping the drag it made for just a moment. That was all it took, but he was starting to realize how that wouldn't be enough. Just a moment of decay didn't correlate to being a very large blast. It was the same as touching the ground for a brief second. A small portion of it would crumble, but nothing more. Of course, with non-living objects, it would just continue to spread, even without his direct contact, but that didn't work with the air as well, as much as he would have wished it would. It all came back to feeling the air, as Gran Torino had first said. If he could actively touch it while in the same way he could with normal objects, then he wouldn't have to worry about catching the drag. But going right back into his efforts to feel the air probably wouldn't be any more fruitful. His relative success relied on moving to catch the drag like he did with his scythe. The air remained still. He was the one moving. The logical next step would be to swap those places, make the air move so he could stay still, but how would he make the air move? He didn't have a wind quirk. Wind! Midori exclaimed. I can't believe I forgot wind exists. I'm so dumb. I would say tunnel-visioned, but I digress. Thami couldn't resist the playful jab. What about wind? Okay, so I swipe to make a drag. Drag lets me feel the air. He quickly made small blasts to demonstrate. I'm the one moving this scenario. But what if I could get the air to move for me? I see your point, but you cannot guarantee the air will be breezy when you need to move and fight. Thami wrote that down for good measure, looking up afterwards. Plus, even if today were windy, which it is not, you would need to leave this alley to test your idea, and there are not exactly many places secluded enough like Dagoba to get away with quirk usage. No, I'm not planning on relying on wind. I still want to get to a point where I can make blasts with still air. This is like a bridge, you know? Thami tapped thoughtfully at his chin, or at least where his chin probably was. I see, that makes sense, but there still is not any wind. You may have better luck holding off until tomorrow. We could try to find a spot outside of the alley as well. Midori pouted. He didn't want to wait, as childish as it sounded. He only had a week with Gran Torino, and he was already well into the third day. He didn't have a lot of free time to mess around or wait for ideal conditions to just reveal themselves, but Gami did have a point, as much as it annoyed him to admit that so often. Today just wasn't a windy day. And even if it was, even with his practically empty neighborhood, there wasn't a good spot nearby that would let him work with the wind without interruption. Public quirk usage was still illegal after all, and it wasn't like Gran Torino was with him to give him an excuse. Times like this he really missed Dagoba and all the comforts of home. His exhaustion was starting to catch up to him, forcing him to slump against one of the alley walls. He wasn't really used to exerting himself like this, and it definitely showed. All those pole vaults during the obstacle course left him more messed up than he'd like to admit. He raised his head, trying to stop the sweat from running into his eyes. He'd have to make more of an effort with his physical abilities. He thought he had decent enough stamina, but maybe that was just more for staying conscious after taking a death blow. The sun shone aggressively into his eyes. It hadn't bothered him before, but it certainly changed position through the hours that he'd been out here. It peaked just over the rooftop of Gran Torino's building, just high enough to escape cover. Truly an unfortunate annoyance. Gami watched his successor think, sensing they were at least taking a break from training and deciding to close up the notebook. What is on your mind? Midori in turn pointed up to the roof. I wonder how possible it is to get up there. The ghost moved his gaze to follow, only to shy away at the intrusive light. Well, Gran Torino did say he owned the building. I would presume it's only a matter of asking why. The teen hummed but didn't respond right away. How windy do you think it is up there? And with a mischievous smirk, it all clicked. Let us find out, shall we? The duo picked themselves up, this time Midoriya grabbing his notebook and pen from Gami, and shambled out of the alleyway. His costume stuck to him awkwardly from all the sweat. Maybe he'd change into something more breathable while he was at it. He liked training with his costume on because it was exactly as he would be fighting out on the field. Having to now wash it again was less than desirable, however. Gami raced ahead of him. Letting himself in straight through the door, Midoriya smothered his laugh with a sigh as he opened the door for himself. Geez, you really are an early bird. That was Gran Torino's idea of a morning greeting as he sat calmly at the small table in the kitchen, stirring a cup of tea. Any more progress? Excited at his interest, Midori had stepped forward. I actually figured out how to start making blasts yesterday. I know I can still improve them, but I've got it down to a science. The elder had raised an eyebrow, a bit solemn in his movements. Impressive. So what are you doing in here, then? The roof. He pointed a telling finger upwards. Can I go up there? Let me go get the key to the door. Gran Torino hopped off his seat with little argument. He retreated into his room for a moment, popping back out all of a sudden and tossing a set of keys in Midori's general direction. You're not going to be rooftop hopping up there, are you? The teen caught the keys, shaking his head adamantly. No, just going to keep working. I've got an idea I want to test. If it works, though, that might be my next course of action. Gran Torino chuckled lightly, returning to his tea. Hold off on that, would you? I've got a few mobility techniques I'd like to show you first. The hero didn't look up from his drink, missing the way Midori's eyes had widened in shock and excited anticipation. Yeah. Won't go jumping any buildings. Thanks for the keys. Midori climbed up the stairs, still a little stunned from the conversation. He slinked back into his room quickly, changing into a cleaner set of clothes. He left his costume on a hanger. He'd wash it later. There were more important things to focus on. Now I really have to get this to work, he whined longingly, trudging up to the third floor. You saw how insane his movements were before. We couldn't even hit him. Gami scouted out the area, determining the path to the fourth-floor stairs was safe. I agree. He just has to hold firm on that offer. Midori's attitude dropped slightly, reminded of Gran Torino's less than helpfulness so far. Yeah. I am sure that he will, however. He backtracked as they arrived on the 4th floor, ruffling his hair gently. But let us focus on the next step first. The teen nodded a bit more happily this time, making his way to the next stairway. Instead of seeing another floor, however, was met with a sealed door. Midori shuffled the set of keys in his hand. Most of them were too small for the lock in front of him. He could take a guess as to which one opened up the rooftop door. And sure enough, he guessed correctly on the first try, pushing open the rusty door with a little more effort than he thought he needed. Gami coiled into himself and was retreating back into the stairwell. It is too bright up here. It's the same as outside of the alley. Midori rolled his eyes sarcastically. But it's actually surprisingly windy up here, more than I thought. If he still had his hat on, it would have surely been lost to the breeze by now by the way that his hair had tousled against his scalp. He could see a good portion of the neighborhood from up here, and it was solitary enough for him to probably get away with some training. No one could bother him up here. It was so peaceful, almost like sitting on the shores of Dagoba. Sure, he might be a little loud, but if he wasn't being heard from the alley, he surely wouldn't be heard from this newfound perch. Izuku, I am unsure as to why you were smiling. Sorry, just thinking about how nice it is up here. He moved away from the door, planting himself in a space where there was nothing obstructing the airflow around him. I'm gonna get started. Of course, let me just... Gami paused suddenly, reaching for a notebook that wasn't there. Damn, I knew I forgot something. I will be right back. Don't get caught, he yelled to his mentor, but the ghost was already long gone. Having passed back down through the rooftop, Midori thought about waiting for Gami to return with their collective notes. That made more sense, but he was far more excited at the prospect of learning something new, both in the blast and whatever Gran Torino was thinking of teaching him, and through the way the wind had danced around him, something peaceful called out to his soul to just try. He extended both of his hands out, keeping his palms facing each other to cup the breeze, but still angled outward so he wouldn't blast himself by accident. Wind slithered through his fingers, a cool coil against his skin. It was almost like his hands were underwater, so completely encompassed by the sensation and yet so vastly different. Wind was nothing comforting like the hug of water, but rather a fleeting kiss of frostbite. Wind was nothing like the calm of the ocean, but rather a powerfully forceful snap to his body. Wind was nothing like the remembrance of water. Wind forgot. He could whisper his secrets to its waiting ears in full confidence that they would drift away into nothingness not a moment after, and wind enticed him in such a way that he would gladly do that over and over again, even if it carried his deepest fears for all to hear. The breeze curled in his chest with each breath he took, savoring the way it wrapped around his heart in the same way adrenaline coated his veins, fully yet not overwhelming in the slightest. And with the beckoning echo, DT was called for so naturally he almost forgot it wasn't his quirk to begin with. An explosion ripped through the space, and Midori was so caught off guard that if the recoil didn't knock him down already, his shock would have. He landed abruptly on his rear, his hands instinctively bracing to catch his fall, but he didn't decay the rooftop the moment that he came into contact with it, much to his surprise. His DT wasn't even running through his veins anymore. He hadn't even thought about bringing it forth, much less calling it back. He hadn't even thought at all. And yet here he was, rocked by the biggest explosion that he'd made so far without hurting himself. Midori blinked owlishly. Had he felt the air so unconsciously that he didn't even realize it, on his first try, with just blind faith and feeling? His stupefied expression had morphed into an ecstatic, toothy grin. He stared down at his hands, flexing his fingers slowly just to make sure everything felt normal. Well, as normal as someone like him could get. I have the notebook. Did I miss something? Midori turned to face his mentor, his goofy smile growing even larger. Oh yeah, you missed a lot of somethings. Midori didn't come down for lunch. He wouldn't have come down for dinner either, if it wasn't for Gami practically dragging him off the roof, and even then, what he ate couldn't be counted as dinner in any rational person's mind. It could be argued, though, that right now Midori was no rational person, not by the way he was completely and utterly captivated by how effortlessly his DT was flowing. He'd long gotten to the point where decaying physical objects was merely instinct, but he didn't have to think about what he was doing. He just touched it, and that was all it took to transfer DT. It took a little more effort to get that decay to stop when he wanted it to, but he attributed that to its destructive nature. All that power running through him craved to destroy. As much as he didn't want to admit that, as a hero in training, though he was fairly capable of making sure that power never got out of hand. With air, however, the DT flow was so natural it was almost like he'd been doing this as long as he had with physical objects. He presumed the active breeze helped considerably, but even then, the progress he'd made in only a few hours was insane. He was pulling out blast after blast without a single swipe, and without the loss of momentum from before. They were much more powerful, and he barely had to think. It wasn't like the sports festival or his attempts at Dagoba, where he had to call upon thoughts of desperation and fear to force it out. The wind called to him so serenely. He was practically wrapped around its pinky finger, or rather, more literally, it was wrapped around his. But it was all the same. He could feel the air, and by God, it was something he was addicted to. He could feel the freedom, the peace, the completeness, and he wondered how he'd gone his life so far without it. Midori probably would have spent the entire night up on the roof if it wasn't for Gran Torino's forced intervention. Apparently it was late, that heroes needed proper rest or something. Either way, the teen begrudgingly left the solace of the rooftop for sleep, and in his disappointment, he missed the impressed look that Gran Torino gave him. Gami never missed these things, however. And that's how the ghost ended up sticking with his successor tonight, rather than going off wandering like he usually did, because he never missed how much Midori was overworking himself these past few days. He didn't miss how Midori had always reassured him that he slept just fine as he crawled out of a sleeping bag on the floor. He didn't miss how Midori always looked hurt each time Gran Torino refused to actively train him. He didn't miss how Midori was hypercompensating from the massive amounts of stress constantly being dumped on him through rigorous and, quite frankly, unhealthy amounts of self-training. So Gami decided from the first night of the internship it wouldn't hurt to stick around at night and just make sure that Midori got enough rest to properly function the next day. He could always wander another night. He wouldn't be too inhibited. In fact, he was actually losing the antsiness that left him roaming the streets at night, or so he had noticed. There was an uncomfortable dullness in his soul that called for him to just be still, to plant himself and never move, never think again. That new piece of him, of a him lost to him, unnerved Gami beyond belief. What mannerisms truly belonged to him and not to the shell of a man he left behind? As the pitiful excuse for his personality mashed with the memories that he was getting back, where did he stop and that man begin? He was so eager to learn about who he once was, but now he wasn't so sure. He liked being himself, and it was almost as if learning a new portion of the man before him had killed something equal in him now. If he was to remember everything about who he was before, what would happen to Gami? He waved those thoughts away. He did not need to have an existential crisis right now. He'd always be Gami. He'd always be with Midoriya. That was that. The ghost moved away from the corner he was floating in before, shifting back to Midoriya's sleeping form to check on him. He was wrapped pretty tightly in the fluff of the sleeping bag to the point where Gami could barely see him, but even with the cover, he noticed the teen was shifting around much more than he usually did. He got closer, and was that a scowl on his face? Nervously, Gami had circled around his sleeping successor. Should he wake him? He didn't want to disturb his sleep. God knows he needed it, especially after today. But what if something was wrong? Something seemed wrong. Midori suddenly shifted a bit more violently than before, throwing down the cover in aggressive movements. His pained expression was more than clear now, his eyes screwed shut in a trapped slumber. That was all the justification Gami needed. Izuku, are you all right? He gently shook the boy, but he didn't wake. Something was wrong. Izuku, wake up. In his panic, he shook Midori harder than he intended, and he was unable to relax even when that wasn't enough. That should have been enough. Midori had always been a light sleeper. That should have been enough for any human, in fact. No call of sleep was that strong. The only thing that he could possibly think of that would trap him in unconsciousness other than unconsciousness itself was a premonition. Gami growled instinctively at the thought, a frustration laced with sympathetic sadness. Couldn't the boy just be allowed to rest? It was sickeningly sneaky for his visions to bombard him at the one time he chose to let his guard down. He didn't want to think about who was haunting his dreams, more likely than not, but as much as he had wished otherwise, there wasn't anything he could really do. There was no way for Gami to wake his successor out of a premonition. He'd tried. It wasn't fair. Everything was so out of his control. Was he cursed to forever be condemned to the sidelines? He had nothing, other than the boy in front of him. Why couldn't he do more? His bony fingers fumbled with the sleeping bag. His solidity was definitely suffering from the intensity of his emotions right now, his body growing wispier than usual. It took a couple of tries to yank the zipper all the way down, but he managed. If anything, he presumed Midoriya wouldn't want to wake up confined to the tightness of the sleeping bag. He was tempted to pull the teen into his lap, but he figured that he'd get up in quite a bit of shock, and so maybe his close proximity wouldn't help as much as he wanted. So Gami waited in tense silence, just off to the side, unable to cease his pained flinches every time Midori had shifted to distressed. It couldn't have lasted any longer than 2 minutes, but it felt like an eternity, and to a ghost who had lived one, the feeling was not welcomed back. Midori suddenly shot up, gasping animalistically for breath, grasping at himself to confirm that he was all in one piece. His forehead was drenched in sweat. Most of his skin was, in fact, and his eyes looked one moment away from bursting into tears. The teen threaded a hand into his hair, grabbing at it aggressively, the other hand violently pushing away the pulled-back covers, mixed with all the shock and grief. There was this lost look on his face, almost like he was piecing together what had just happened. Gami floated closer slowly, trying not to startle him any more than he already was. Izuku, what? But he was cut off as Midori had lurched away from him, reaching for his phone in a panic. He'd scrambled fully out of the sleeping bag at this point, having kicked it to the side as he tapped away at the screen relentlessly. What is wrong? I do not understand. Midori ignored him, again, as a soft ringing had filled the room, the iconic sounds of a phone call. It rang once. Gami remained frozen, unsure of what was going on, unsure of how to respond. It rang twice. The panic on Midori's face was evident as he had clutched the phone in a death grip. It rang 3 times. The ghost slowly shuffled closer, trying to see who Midori was calling. It rang 4 times. The ringing abruptly stopped. Hello? Midori exhaled so roughly it almost sounded like static, gripping his sweat-drenched shirt. Ida, thank God. Thank God you picked up. Are you all right? Stop. Ida's voice was blunt and angry, and it made Midori flinch from the other end. It's 3 a.m. What do you want? Midori hesitated, words getting caught in his throat. He looked like he wanted to say something so badly, but instead he forced it back down. I'm really worried about you. I have a really bad feeling about the next few days. Promise me that you won't do anything dangerous, please. Shut the fuck up, Midoriya. A pitiful whine escaped his throat like a kicked puppy, despite all the efforts to contain it. I'm tired of you constantly bothering me. I don't know how to get it through your thick skull that I don't want anything to do with you. I don't care if you're worried. I don't care what you're feeling, and I certainly don't care to listen to you. Ida. No, I'm done. I'm done with this, with you. Don't call me again. There was a harsh click right after. No time for Midori to interject, and the room was filled with the shrill sounds of a hang-up dial tone. Midori held the phone unmoving, his lip quivering uncontrollably. He pressed the call button again, but it didn't even entertain him with a ring, going straight to voicemail. Gami didn't even know what to say as the teen had dropped the phone with a sharp crash and collapsed into himself. Come here. But in fact, he was the one to move to envelop the boy into a cold hug. Not that he fought against it. That was the last straw before Midori had burst into tears, heaving and sobbing into Gami's robe. The ghost could tell he was trying to say something, but between the wetness in his throat and the robe against his face, it was too muffled to be understood. Instead, Gami just held him tighter, running a bony hand up and down his back. We will figure it out, I promise. Midori wailed harder, an anguished sound of fear and hurt that Gami really didn't want to hear any more than he had to. It had been a while since they had held each other so close like this, and the ghost had been hoping for it to remain that way, but in a world like this, where suffering was always around the corner, where death didn't discriminate between sinners and saints, there was never going to be any reprieve for a boy just trying to do what he thought was right. Gami wanted to be angry at Ida, but even he knew there was really no justification for that, not when Ida was just as much of a victim in the universe's sick game as everyone else in Midoriya's life. If there was anything to be angry at, it was the world, but if Gami could truly do anything about it, the world would already be on fire. I don't want him to. His voice was barely audible, hidden by such smallness it was like it wasn't there at all. I don't want to lose him. You won't. He reassured him like it was so obvious, running a hand through his hair. It is going to be all right. He wasn't sure if it was going to be all right. He wished he was. I would figure you do not wish to go back to bed. He could feel Midoriya's head shake from against his chest. Talk to me about something. Anything. I don't want to think about it any more. Gami faltered for a second, struggling to grasp onto anything substantial. I will tell you a story from my age, he started, about a girl who traveled the land with a mystic beast to capture the sun on a canvas. Neither slept for the rest of the night, snuggled within each other's arms until the sun itself had stopped by to listen to the tale. All right, everyone. This concludes Chapter 40 of Deku and Death. Chapter 41 will be next. I hope you guys are still enjoying this one, and as always, thank you so much for listening.